Have you ever stopped to think about what truly drives us? Why we have the thoughts we do, experience the feelings we feel, and ultimately act in the ways we do?
It's a fundamental question, isn't it?
It really is. And today we're embarking on a deep dive into, well, a stack of information specifically, an introduction to the fascinating world of psychology. We want to pull out the core ideas, the most compelling insights for you.
That's right. Psychology, it can feel immense, almost overwhelming sometimes.
Oh.
So our aim here is to navigate this landscape with you, provide a clear, engaging, and hopefully insightful overview of the key aspects.
Exactly. We've basically gone through an entire introductory unit. And as you can imagine, that lays out a very structured foundation for understanding, well, the complexities of our behavior and our mental lives.
Think of us as your guides, pointing out the most interesting landmarks, maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
And our mission today is, well, it's pretty ambitious, actually. We want to equip you with a solid grasp of what psychology is at its core, how it evolved into the science we recognize today, the different lenses, the perspectives psychologists use.
Right.
The many ways this knowledge gets applied in the real world, and crucially, how psychology actually does its research scientifically. We'll even touch on its early roots in India.
Okay, lots to cover, so let's get started.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's begin by unpacking the word itself. Psychology. It's got a fascinating history, actually.
It really does. Comes from Greek, right?
Yeah, psyche, which originally meant something like soul or life force, and logos, meaning knowledge or explanation.
So literally the study of the soul. That's quite something.
It is. But what's interesting is how that focus shifted over time. Early thinkers, they were grappling with these huge questions about human existence.
Right, the big philosophical stuff.
Exactly. And as the field developed, there was this move towards studying things that felt maybe a bit more tangible. Psychologists started favoring the term mind.
We seem perhaps more observable, or at least more open to systematic inquiry than the soul.
Possibly, yeah. And it's kind of wild to realize that psychology as its own scientific discipline is actually pretty recent.
One of the last fields to really break away from philosophy back in the 19th century.
But look at its impact now. It's everywhere, woven into so much of our daily lives.
Absolutely. And the definition we often use today reflects that journey. Psychology is the science of behavior and mental processes.
Okay, let's break that down. Science. What does that really mean here?
Well, it underscores the systematic approach, how psychologists gather information, through careful observation, controlled experiments, trying to be objective.
So not just guesswork or opinion.
Exactly. And importantly, this knowledge isn't just for show. It's aimed at tackling real-world problems, finding solutions.
Right. And then behavior. That seems straightforward enough.
Yeah, it covers all our outward actions and reactions. Anything we do that can be observed, recorded. Simple movements, complex social stuff, even thoughts, emotions, attitudes in a way.
Okay. And the last bit, mental processes.
Those are the internal things, the unseen activities inside us. Thinking, feeling, remembering, problem solving, all that inner stuff.
The American Psychological Association offers a broader definition too, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. Something like the study of the mind and behavior, encompassing, well, pretty much the whole spectrum of human experience. It's quite comprehensive.
So keeping that definition in mind, let's dig a bit deeper into this idea of psychology as a science. It's clearly more than just, casual observation.
Oh, absolutely. Its roots are tangled up with philosophy, particularly epistemology, which is all about how we know things, and also physiology, the study of the body.
Right, the mind-body connection has always been there.
Exactly. And the shift towards becoming an independent science, it was really spurred on by breakthroughs in other fields. Think about Darwin and evolution, Newton and physics, Mendeleev and the periodic table.
They all pushed for a systematic, evidence-based way of understanding things.
Precisely. So early on, psychology often focused on those links between mind, body, physical world. But naturally, as it grew, it expanded to include social factors, cultural influences.
And there's still that debate, isn't there? Is it primarily a natural science or a social science?
That's a key point. If you see it as a natural science, you often emphasize things like natural monism. The idea that everything, including the mind, can ultimately be explained physically.
Reductionism, basically.
Sort of, yeah. And operationism, defining concepts by how you measure them. And determinism, the idea that actions have causes.
Okay, but what about the social science view?
Well, the focus shifts a bit. You still value systematic observation, empirical data, of course, but there's maybe a greater emphasis on understanding behavior within its social, its cultural context. You might use quantitative data and qualitative insights to get the full picture.
And underpinning all of this scientific approach is empiricism, right? The idea that knowledge comes through our senses. Goes back to thinkers like Locke.
Exactly. That reliance on sensory information, on observation, leads directly to the need for controlled variables, for studies that other people can replicate.
If someone else can't get the same results, the finding is questioned.
Precisely. And while number-crunching quantitative methods have been dominant for a long time, qualitative approaches exploring the why and how in depth are really gaining importance too. They add richness.
And all this research, it's not just collecting facts randomly. It feeds into developing theories, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Theories are like frameworks. They help us organize what we observe, explain it, and even predict future behavior. It's a dynamic process. Theories guide research, and research refines or challenges theories.
Now, the unit also mentioned nomothetic versus ideographic approaches. Those sound pretty academic.
They do, but the idea is simple enough. Nomothetic is about finding general laws, principles that apply broadly across many people. So you study large groups, look for common patterns.
Looking for the universal stuff.
You got it. Ideographic, on the other hand, is about understanding the particular, getting really deep into one individual's experience or one specific event. It emphasizes uniqueness, context. Think of a detailed biography.
Got it. Big picture versus close-up. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Talk about the origins. That quote by Ebbinghaus, "Psychology has a short history but a long past." It's brilliant.
It really is. Because while psychology as a formal science only kicked off in the late 1800s, people have been pondering the mind, behavior, consciousness for millennia.
Right, back to the ancient Greeks. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they were asking fundamental questions.
Absolutely. Socrates saying, know thyself. That really points to that early focus on self-reflection, understanding our inner world.
And even much later, Descartes in the 17th century trying to locate consciousness physically, suggesting the pineal gland was the seat of the soul.
Yeah, fascinating stuff, that blend of philosophy and early, almost biological speculation.
So what pushed it towards being more scientific?
A big factor was the success of experimental methods in other sciences, like physics. People started thinking, hey, maybe we can apply these rigorous methods to the mind too.
Ah, like Fechner's work. Psychophysics. Exactly.
Gustav Fechner, exploring the link between physical stimuli and our sensory experience. That was a key early step in scientifically studying psychological processes.
And then the big one, 1879, Wilhelm Wundt, Leipzig, Germany, the first lab.
That's the landmark moment. Wundt is often called the father of experimental psychology. And it didn't take long for this new science to cross the Atlantic.
Right. Wundt's student, G. Stanley Hall, set up a lab in the U.S. just a few years later, 1883.
At Johns Hopkins, yeah. And then things really started organizing. The American Psychological Association, the APA, formed in 1892. Hall was his first president.
And William James. Can't forget his book, The Principles of Psychology. That was huge in shaping the field in America.
Absolutely seminal work. So initially, the focus was very much on empirically studying basic mental stuff, thinking, attention, imagery, trying to break down consciousness.
But like any science, it didn't stay monolithic for long, did it? Different ideas started popping up.
Exactly. Different schools of thought emerged, offering contrasting views on what psychology should even be studying and how.
Okay, let's walk through some of those main schools. First up, Structuralism. Wundt and his student, Titchener.
Right. Structuralism was all about dissecting consciousness into its basic elements, like sensations, images, feelings. Their main tool was objective introspection.
Objective introspection. Sounds like a contradiction.
Kinda, yeah. Trained people tried to analyze and report their own sensory experiences objectively. The goal was to find the building blocks of the mind. It was important for establishing psychology as a lab science, but it didn't last forever.
Okay, then functionalism. William James, John Dewey. Seems like a reaction to that.
Very much so. Functionalism, heavily influenced by Darwin, shifted focus from the structure of the mind to its function, its purpose.
How does it help us adapt?
Exactly. How do things like learning, memory, problem solving help us survive and thrive in our environment? That was their question.
Interesting. Then Gestalt psychology. Wertheimer, Kafka, Kohler. Their famous line, "The whole is greater than the sum of its parts."
Right. Gestalt psychologists argued we don't just perceive bits and pieces of sensation. Our minds actively organize them into meaningful wholes or gestalts.
Like seeing a face, not just eyes, nose, mouth.
Precisely. They studied principles of perception, how we group things. It really changed how we understood perception.
Okay, now for a big shift. Behaviourism. Watson, Skinner, Pavlov's influence, they kind of threw out the mind altogether.
Pretty much. Behaviorism said psychology should only study observable behavior and the environmental triggers for that behavior. Forget consciousness, forget feelings you can't see.
Wow, so it's all about learning, conditioning.
Largely, yes. Pavlov's dogs, classical conditioning. Skinner's work on how rewards and punishments shape behavior, operant conditioning. That was the focus.
And then, completely different again, psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, bringing the unconscious front and center.
Hugely influential. Freud argued that unconscious drives, conflicts, often from childhood, shape our personality and can cause distress.
Through things like free association dream analysis.
Exactly. Accessing those hidden thoughts, memories, feelings. His ideas and those of his followers, the Neo-Freudians, created the whole psychodynamic approach. Still very impactful today.
Then came the humanistic perspective. Maslow, Rogers. A more optimistic view.
Definitely. It was partly a reaction against behaviorism and psychoanalysis, which some saw as too deterministic or negative. Humanism emphasized free will, personal growth, striving for self-actualization.
Reaching your potential, the third force in psychology.
That's what they called it, yeah. Focus on the individual's subjective experience, their capacity for choice.
Okay, and then the cognitive perspective seems to bring the mind back, but maybe in a new way. Ebbinghaus, Bartlett, Piaget.
Yes, a sort of cognitive revolution, a renewed focus on those higher mental processes. Memory, language, problem-solving, decision-making.
What drove that?
Partly the limitations of behaviorism. It couldn't really explain complex stuff like language acquisition easily. And also the rise of computers gave psychologists a new metaphor, a new way to think about information processing in the mind.
Makes sense. Then the sociocultural perspective, looking outwards at society and culture. Leon Festinger is mentioned.
Right. This perspective stresses how our social groups, our cultural backgrounds, shape how we think and act. Social norms, values, class, ethnicity. All these things matter. Festinger's cognitive dissonance theory is a classic example of looking at social influence on cognition.
And finally, the biological and evolutionary perspectives.
Getting back to the body and our evolutionary past.
Exactly. The biological perspective looks at the brain, nervous system, hormones, the physical basis of behavior and thought. And the evolutionary perspective, inspired by Darwin, asks how our psychological traits might be adaptations, evolved over time to help us survive and reproduce.
Wow. It's incredible, the sheer range of angles psychologists take to understand us.
It really is. So let's move on to the practical side. The different subfields. It's obviously way more than just therapy, right?
Oh, absolutely. Though maybe first it's useful to quickly distinguish between, say, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, and a psychiatric social worker.
Good point.
Generally, a psychologist has a doctorate, researches, or practices. A psychiatrist is an MD, a medical doctor specializing in mental disorders, can prescribe medication. And a psychiatric social worker often has a master's, focusing more on the social, environmental factors around mental health issues.
Okay, useful distinction. So what are some of those main subfields where psychologists work?
Well, there's cognitive psychology, focusing on thinking, memory, learning, all that internal stuff.
Right.
Clinical psychology is probably the best known. Assessment, diagnosis, treatment of mental disorders.
Like therapy, mostly.
Often, yes, but also research, teaching. Then counseling psychology, which often deals with maybe milder issues, everyday problems, career guidance, relationship stuff.
Okay. And environmental psychology. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, looks at how people and their physical surroundings interact, how to improve that interaction, promote sustainability. Then you've got school psychology, working within schools, helping students with learning, social emotional issues.
And educational psychology is slightly different.
A bit broader, yeah. Looks at the psychology of teaching and learning overall, how to make education more effective, understand learning processes, motivation.
What about experimental psychology?
That's really about conducting controlled experiments, often in labs, to understand basic processes, learning, perception, memory, foundational research.
And physiological psychology.
That directly links brain and behavior, studying the nervous system, hormones, often using both animal and human research.
Then organizational psychology, taking psychology into the workplace.
Exactly, improving employee well-being, performance. Things like selection, training, job satisfaction, teamwork.
Social psychology, how we interact.
Yep, Groups, relationships, attitudes, persuasion, how being in a group affects individual behavior.
Developmental psychology must cover a lot of ground.
It does. Studying changes across the entire lifespan, from infancy to old age. Cognitive development, social, moral, language, everything.
Community psychology sounds important too.
Very much so. Addressing problems at the community level, social issues, health problems, helping communities build resources, maybe using traditional therapies alongside others.
And then more specialized areas like sports psychology.
Helping athletes with performance, teamwork, motivation.
Health psychology.
The link between psychological factors, behavior, and physical health and illness.
And forensic psychology. Psychology in the legal system.
Right. Working with courts, law enforcement, dealing with criminal behavior, victim issues, policy. The range is just huge.
It really shows how psychology touches almost every part of life. And psychologists work in all sorts of places, not just clinics.
Absolutely. Universities, schools, hospitals, government, businesses, private practice. It's incredibly diverse.
Okay, so we know what psychology studies and where it's applied. Let's talk about how they do it. The research. The unit really stresses that psychology's claim to being a science rests on its methods.
Fundamentally, yes. Minimizing bias, being systematic. There are core goals in scientific research. First, description. Just observing and recording behavior, what's happening.
Okay.
Second, explanation. Developing theories to understand why it's happening. Third, prediction. Anticipating behavior based on theory and observation. And fourth, control. Using that understanding to influence behavior, hopefully for the better.
And there's a kind of standard process for doing research, right? Starting with a question.
Exactly. It usually starts with curiosity. You observe something interesting, you ask a question. Like the example, does lots of screen time affect kids' attention?
Right.
That leads to step 2. Formulating a hypothesis. A specific testable prediction, like increased screen time leads to lower attention spans.
And testing that hypothesis is key.
It's the core of it. That leads to theory development. Step 3 is actually testing it. Choosing a research design, collecting data, analyzing it.
And then interpreting the results. Does the evidence support the hypothesis or not?
Precisely. Using statistics for quantitative data or interpretive methods for qualitative data, looking for patterns, differences, associations.
And the final step is crucial too, reporting the results.
Absolutely. Sharing findings so others can see them, critique them, try to replicate them. Replication is vital for confidence in the results. If a study can be repeated with similar outcomes, it builds reliability.
Okay, so what are the main methods psychologists use? The unit mentioned descriptive, experimental, and correlational.
Right. Descriptive methods, first off, aim to just observe and describe behavior as it happens naturally. No manipulation by the researcher.
Like case studies.
Exactly. In-depth study of one person or a small group. Think Freud's work, or Piaget studying his own children. Great for rich detail, generating ideas, but hard to generalize from.
Okay. What else is descriptive?
Surveys. Asking lots of people questions, interviews, questionnaires. Good for getting broad data quickly, but depends on people answering honestly and accurately and having a representative sample.
And systematic observation.
Just carefully watching and recording behavior. Can be in a natural setting, naturalistic observation, or more structured. The goal is just to describe what you see.
Okay, then the experimental method. This is the one for cause and effect, right?
That's its strength, yes. You manipulate an independent variable, something you think causes a change.
Like changing the temperature in a room.
Right. And then you measure its effect on a dependent variable, say people's mood.
Yeah.
Crucially, you try to control everything else.
Using control groups.
Often, yes. An experimental group gets the manipulation. The changed temperature, a control group doesn't. You compare them. Or sometimes you use within group designs, comparing the same people before and after. The key is control and replicability.
Are there downsides to experiments?
Sure. Sometimes they can feel artificial, not like real life. And there are ethical considerations, especially with humans and animals. You have to be careful.
Right. And finally, the correlational method, looking for relationships.
Exactly. Seeing if two variables tend to go together. Does an increase in one relate to an increase or decrease in another? You measure both variables in a group of people.
And you get a correlation coefficient.
Yep. Ranges from +1, perfect positive correlation as one goes up, the other goes up, to -1. Perfect negative as one goes up, the other goes down. 0 means no linear relationship.
Like maybe intelligence and happiness. Is there a link?
You could study that correlationally, but remember the big caveat. Correlation doesn't equal causation. Just because two things are related doesn't mean one causes the other. There could be a third factor involved.
Got it. Super important point. Okay, this gives a great picture of the foundations and methods. Now let's switch focus to psychology in India. The unit mentioned it started with a strong Western influence.
That seems to be the case, according to the source. Initially, it didn't perhaps connect as much with the rich philosophical traditions already present in India concerning the mind and self.
When did it formally start in universities?
The first formal steps were at the University of Calcutta. A syllabus was prepared around 1905 by Sir Brjendranath Seal, and teaching began in 1916. Dr. N.N. Sengupa, who trained at Harvard, was the first faculty member, and the Western model was largely adopted.
But weren't there efforts early on to blend traditions? Dhirendra Shekhar Bose?
Absolutely. Bose was a really key figure. A psychoanalyst, he founded the Indian Psychoanalytic Society in 1922, and he actively tried to integrate Hindu thought with Freudian ideas, even in his doctoral thesis back in 1921. Quite pioneering.
And the field grew from there. Other universities, organizations.
Yes, it spread. Mysore University started courses in 1924, the same year the Indian Psychological Association was formed. And impressively, the first journal, the Indian Journal of Psychology, started just 2 years later.
Wow, that's quick.
It is. Then programs started at Aligarh Muslim University, Madras University. Later, Delhi University established a strong department. And important institutions like Niyam Hans in Bangalore were set up. It shows a steady growth.
And is there now more focus on integrating indigenous Indian perspectives?
It seems so. While Western models are still very relevant, there's a growing movement to study human behavior using indigenous techniques and drawing on India's own philosophical and cultural heritage alongside those Western approaches. It's becoming more integrated.
So the field in India is quite dynamic now.
Very much so. With active journals, associations, and many prominent psychologists contributing across different areas, drawing on both global and local knowledge, it's an evolving picture.
This has been incredibly thorough, a real deep dive. We've gone from the basic definition through the history, the different schools, the huge range of subfields, the research methods, and even looked at its development in India.
We covered a lot of ground. And remember, this is foundational. Hopefully it sparks some interest for you, the listener. Maybe a particular school of thought caught your attention, or a subfield, or the history.
Yeah, something to explore further.
Exactly. There's always more to learn in this field. It's constantly evolving.
Which leads to a final thought, really. Given how much psychology has evolved in trying to understand us, what do you think the next big breakthrough might be? Where's the frontier in understanding ourselves?
That's a fantastic question to ponder. What's next for psychology?